tempo is going to be quick. You know, we're not, as I said, we're not going to dwell on the complexities of some of the more difficult problems because they require a very concentrated sort of effort to appreciate and understand, and people understand them in a whole variety of different ways. And so I don't want the meetings to get bogged down on any particular idea. And so when we come across an idea that's complex and impossible for us to resolve entirely or completely for our satisfaction, we just have to say, okay, we're gonna have to come back to that, and we'll just move on. Okay, so so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring up the text that I have put on a Word document because it's just convenient for me to do it this way. And then you can all see what I'm doing. Can you actually, Patrick, can you allow me to share the screen?
Oh, how do I do that?
Okay, I'm just gonna take back
the
yeah, I'll just take it back and just
okay, I see it here. I think allow
screen sharing. That's all you have to do is allow screen sharing.
I don't see it in the menu. So you better take back the.
Well, if you go to share screen.
Sure. Okay.
And then just say allow share screen. Okay.
Multiple participants can share simultaneously, so this should be okay. Can you?
Okay. Yeah, I have it. Fantastic. Okay, here we go. So I just do this because it sort of keeps me. I'm not sure whether anybody has any difficulty reading that screen to begin with. Is that perfectly clear?
Perfectly clear.
And, all right. And so the reason I do this is because I can remove extraneous matter from the text, and it's easier to concentrate on the text rather than getting preoccupied with notes and things like that. So I'm just going to start reading it. And I'm going to read the definitions completely, and then we can go back and talk about them at least a little bit, and then move on to the axioms. Okay. So definition 1 is, by cause of itself, I understand that whose essence involves existence, or that whose nature cannot be conceived except as existing. Number 2, that thing is said to be finite in its own kind, that can conceive another that is greater. Thus a thought is limited by another thought, but a body is not limited by a thought, nor a thought by a body. It has to be of the same kind, right? By substance, I understand what is in itself and is conceived through itself. It has that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed. I know this is a lot of information very quickly. We're going to come back to this stuff, don't worry. By attribute, I understand what the intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. And then 5, by mode, I understand the affections of a substance, or that which is in another through which it is also conceived. Something that's in another and is also conceived through that other. And by God, I understand a being absolutely infinite. It has a substance consisting of an infinity of attributes, of which each one expresses an eternal and infinite essence. So we're talking about a substance with the number of attributes is infinite, and they each have an eternal and infinite essence. And I'll do the exposition on this one. I say absolute. Oh, I'm thinking I'm going to have to repeat myself. I say absolutely infinite, not infinite in its own kind. For if something is only infinite in its own kind, we can deny infinite attributes of it. Yet as we can conceive infinite attributes which do not pertain to its nature. But if something is absolutely infinite, whatever expresses essence and involves no negation pertains to its essence. So if you're talking about an attribute that is infinite and it expresses an essence, then it necessarily belongs to this absolutely infinite substance. What is absolutely infinite? Okay, that thing is called free, which exists from the necessity of its nature alone and is determined to act by itself alone. But a thing is called necessary, or rather compelled, which is determined by another to exist and to produce an effect in a certain and determinate manner. I can't believe how rich all of these I almost feel like I should go back to the beginning now, but nevertheless, I'll just continue. By eternity, I understand existence itself, insofar as it is conceived to follow necessarily from the definition alone of the eternal thing. And the exposition here is, for such existence, like the essence of a thing, is conceived as an eternal truth, and on that account cannot be explained by duration or time, even if the duration is conceived to be without beginning or end. So that's a very interesting point, I think, but we'll get back to that again. And that's it. That's it for the definition. So, so starting at the top, does anybody have any remarks to make?
Could you give us some examples? Example of a substance, attribute, mode.
Well, that would be really getting ahead of ourselves, I believe. Let's just take it one. Well, okay, one point I want to make. I'm absolutely convinced that the order of exposition and the information that is provided by each of the definitions, the axioms, and even the propositions, it's not. I mean, if you already know on God, for example, then there's not going to be any surprises. But it really is, I think, of value to not get ahead of yourself, to follow the order of exposition as they unfold, because it allows you to not only to get a very clear grasp of the ideas that are being presented, but you also get a very clear grasp of how following propositions depend on those. And many times a proposition will imply a future proposition, but quite often it's even though it's implied, it's better to take the first proposition first and contemplate it alone before thinking about what's going to follow from this. Okay, so go ahead, David.
Yeah, I guess my question would be, so what do we know about what he means by cause here? What is there a background, other books that have already clarified that? And it's funny to underline the word cause, but not the whole thing, cause of itself, which is what D1 is defining, a cause of itself.
Yeah.
So what does it mean then, cause here?
Again, the way that I understand cause, and this is provisional, but the way that I understand cause is that what you're talking, okay, first of all, I believe that everyone knows about the principle of sufficient reason, right? It was a principle that was very popular amongst all the Enlightenment thinkers. The principle of sufficient reason means that there's nothing happens without which you could not provide a complete explanation for. An explanation. If something happens, you provide a complete and comprehensive explanation for that thing. And the explanation that you would provide is, how does the body of causes culminate in this effect, which is the event that you say, I want the principle of sufficient reason should provide me with a complete and comprehensive explanation for this event, which is the effect. And so the principle implies that you can find a comprehensive explanation in terms of the cause. So that's what the principle of sufficient reason for Leibniz is like gospel. You know what I mean? It's the most important thing.
Thanks.
Ever. Who's speaking now? Daniel?
No?
Sorry, I just.
Okay. Okay, so just let me continue. I'm quickly trying to answer David's question, and I'm getting carried away here. But so cause of itself means at the mundane level, a billiard ball hits another billiard ball. You could say, well, what happened there? What was the cause of that, the motion in the second billiard ball? Why is that billiard ball rolling? Well, you could say that it was caused by the force in the first billiard ball. That's one example of a cause. But another way of understanding cause is to say, what is the complete explanation for an event, any single moment in the world that presents itself? You have to have the cause would be the comprehensive explanation for all the nature of reality that would not just lead to and allow for this event to transpire, but actually would show that this event transpired of necessity. A complete explanation would show that it was inevitable that this would happen, because the complete comprehensive explanation for any singular event in the world would be almost like it would include the entire universe. You would never
So
work.
it seems like
It's inexhaustible, right?
so everything we can call thing is caused.
Everything, every singular event is an effect, and everything that is a cause can be treated in a very narrow sense as being, this was the immediate cause, but the complete explanation, according to the principle of sufficient reason, the complete explanation would include almost everything, the nature of the world almost. And
Nothing extraneous. Nothing extraneous.
There would be nothing extraneous to the event. You're right. As an effect, nothing would be completely extraneous. The other thing is that point that I want to make here is that this is not sequential. We're not talking about an order of time, and we're not even talking about a sort of priority of being. Like, it's not like something takes, prior it provides an ontological prior ground for an event. Nothing like that even. In a sense, cause is about the nature of the universe, so it will be something that you could understand the event to be something that holds true of reality or in eternity. So I'm using a lot of really highfalutin language here to explain something that's really not that complicated.
Yeah. I mean, ideas are caused, things are caused, objects are caused, events are caused. Everything I can name as thing is caused. Is that right?
Okay, let me to make it very simple. What I would say is that cause of itself means that it explains itself completely. It completely explains itself, and it is also, unlike other things where you could distinguish one moment from the rest of the universe and say this moment follows from the rest of the universe. What you could say is, in terms of cause here, is that it that's just so very difficult for me to deal with this all of a sudden.
Excuse me, Robert. Daniel has been waiting for a while to get in. Perhaps.
Please go ahead, Daniel. Please
well, actually, I've been waiting longer.
Daniel.
I made a comment and my hand disappeared, and then I had to put it back on.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So once you speak, you're gonna lose your hand too.
Yeah, I know.
They cut your hand off. Yeah.
Yeah, as soon as you speak, it disappears. Okay, I don't know if this is absolutely necessary, because unless he wants to talk about a specific thing that causes itself, everything exists, and its essence has to be existence. It doesn't matter whatever we talk about. So I never understood all these definitions, because they're almost there. I almost grasp it, but then it just escapes me. Is this necessary, number one? Number two, everything exists, and that's its essence as well. So is this really necessary? Is this definition really necessary?
Oh, absolutely, it's necessary.
Robert,
Absolutely, it's
could-
necessary. Let me finish. Let me finish. I figured it out. Okay, I want to reply to
Oh, yeah,
David's. I just want to reply to what David has. Its question here. By cause of itself, what you could say is that okay, this is how broad the word cause can be understood. He says here that its essence involves existence. So if you think of something that has an S, ordinarily in classical philosophy, for example, a philosopher could say, this is the essence, this is the definition of a substance of any kind, right? Now, I can define it, and then I can ask whether it exists, right? Well, for Spinoza, he's saying that this essence that we can define, it involves existence. Existence is part of the definition, the essence of this thing, right? And so therefore, if you think of the essence alone is a kind of cause, and the existence is the effect. So that's how broad the word cause can be used here. The cause here is the essence, the definition or the nature of the thing. And part of the nature of the thing is existence. And so when you think of something whose essence involves existence, you know it exists. And that essence is understood to be a cause. And very quickly before I leave this and go on to other comments here, the other thing is that it's very important to recognize here that essence and nature are synonymous terms, and also that the mere conception, a true conception of the thing, can show you that something actually exists. So it's purely a priori rationalist principles that are being applied here, right? No reference to the nature of reality, but this is a pure concept. Spinoza at this point is not talking about anything that actually exists. He's simply saying, what I understand by the word cause is this. What I understand by the word cause is something that has an essence that includes existence. And when you conceive of that essence, you cannot help but recognize that it of necessity exists. Okay, so I feel like I've satisfied myself, at least in terms of that definition. So
okay, excuse me, Robert. David, you have your hand up. Did you?
Yes. Yeah, I wanted to pipe in my opinion of D1.
Go ahead.
I think in this case, essence that Spinoza is talking about is kind of a Platonic essence. It's kind of like the essence of a guitar is, you know, the form of a guitar. And I think the essence of this of existence is what he's talking about. It's kind of like a characteristic, or it's an internal self-defining characteristics that you have this essence, and that essence, you know, sort of a essence with quotes around it, I think, it gives you existence, because it's part of that essence is to give you existence. And the interesting thing about this is it's self-defining rather than being tied to the rest of the universe. It's actually, you know, you were talking about sufficient reason, and if you take everything far enough, you have to involve the entire universe to have sufficient reason for anything occurring, which I happen to, I like that because that's physics, and I think it's true. But this is kind of the opposite. Well, in the sense that this you don't require the entire universe. Something could have its own essence of existence and not have the entire rest of the universe existing at all. And it would still, by cause of itself, have its own existence. That's how I would look at this D1. It doesn't require the rest of the universe, because Spinoza, I believe, is saying that by cause of itself, meaning it's self-sufficient.
Yeah, you're right. You're right, David. The principle of sufficient reason doesn't really apply here. I don't know why I got lost in that notion.
Robert, can I jump in here? I think really what is going on here is the principle of sufficient reason. And we sort of, in order to understand Spinoza's mindset, we have to go back to the 17th century, where all of the great rationalist philosophers believed that the first thing they had to do was to prove the existence of God by invoking the principle of sufficient reason. Now, I think Leibniz is the clearest on this, where he asks the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And he purports to have an answer for this. If the principle of sufficient reason can supply an answer to this question, why is there something rather than nothing, there has to be something whose existence is necessary, whose essence implies existence, which is the cause of itself. So basically what they're going to do is to say that God is going to think himself into existence. Now, I don't think anyone really takes the full-throated principle of sufficient reason seriously anymore, except for philosophers of religion. But it's a very interesting question, how far down this rabbit hole we want to go. If we're to follow Spinoza and Leibniz, it is necessary to take the principle of sufficient reason at face value. Okay, the idea that there is an answer to every why question. On the meetup page, I put in a reference to a very good paper by Michael de la Rocca on the principle of sufficient reason. He's perhaps the foremost defender of the full-throated principle of sufficient reason nowadays. And he offers a very interesting argument that says, if you're not going to accept the principle of sufficient reason, then you have to tell me, where are you going to draw the line? Which are the questions that have an answer necessarily, and which are the questions which you will not try to answer? Will you, for example, purport to have an answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? I'm not sure if that question really needs to be taken seriously. I, for one, don't take it seriously. But if we're to follow Spinoza, we better take the principle of sufficient reason on board, because he's going to use it left, right, and center, and take it as a brute fact.
Okay.
The principle of sufficient reason says there are no brute facts, but I think if we're to follow Spinoza down the rabbit hole, we better just take it on board.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you should say that, Patrick, because I think that the principle of sufficient reason is absolutely and certainly true. There's no room for interpretation. You know what I mean?
Okay.
I just don't think
Okay, just let me say one thing.
And the other,
we're going to see some very strange consequences of the principle of sufficient reason in Book 1 of the Ethics.
yeah, okay.
So,
So everyone should have a little bit of an understanding of the principle of sufficient reason, because it's something that you'll learn more and more about the principle of sufficient reason. But again, Richard, I think that I want to not lose focus on the nature of these definitions. What Spinoza is saying here in definition 1 is, when I use the word cause, I mean, right? Or rather, when I use the expression cause of itself, what I mean is a thing that has an essence which includes existence of necessity. So everyone knows about the ontological argument. These rationalist philosophers all took the ontological argument very seriously, because they made the claim that I can use pure rationality to prove the existence of God. I don't need any other evidence. All I need is formal logic, and I can show that God of necessity exists. So in a sense, to say that essence belongs to existence, for Descartes, it was like, it's a thing of which nothing greater can be conceived. And something that involves existence is clearly greater than something that does not involve existence. And because we're talking about the greatest thing that can be conceived, we must be talking about a thing that necessarily exists, and that's God. And it goes all the way throughout the history of, Western literature, this whole question about whether existence is truly an essential attribute of anything, whether it's just like any other attribute. It's a very peculiar kind of attribute, if indeed it is an attribute. But for anyone who relies on the ontological argument, they would say existence is an essential attribute of God, because if you were to take it away, it would diminish God. So we'll just leave it at that. But the other thing I really want to make clear here is that he's saying that when you're reading my book and I use the expression cause of itself, this is what I want you to understand by that. He's not talking about the nature of reality here. He's saying, this is how I'm using these words and these expressions. So, and that's in the geometrical, like when you're talking about Euclid's geometry and his, it's called the geometrical method. That's what the name that has attached to it now. And it's this notion that you provide definitions and then you provide some axioms, and then everyone can follow exactly your propositions, because nobody has any difficulty understanding exactly and precisely what these terms mean, right? So that's really why Spinoza is using the geometrical method here. Okay, okay, now I'll shut up, and I want to hear anybody else have any other problems with this.
Does the principle of sufficient reason force you to assume a God at some point? Because otherwise existence can go back to infinity in either direction, and that should be taken as
this is the way that
accepted. But by saying it has a cause, that you have an explanation, you're forced to conclude God. I mean, I don't see how you can escape it using the principle of sufficient reason.
That may be true. That may be true, but we really
can I ask you, Daniel? Could I? If you take the universe to be in the sense of all that is, and ask what is the cause of the universe, it must be the universe. There's nothing outside of the universe. So the universe would be an example, universe understood in that sense, would be an example of something that is the cause of itself.
So that's pantheism. I see it sort of leads into that.
That's
okay,
a label that's frequently stuck on Spinoza.
If I can talk about the principles of sufficient reason in very mundane terms, if you're sitting, if you're sitting in your billiard room, and all of a sudden one of the balls starts rolling across the table, and there's no apparent cause, you say, I want to know what caused that. You don't say, oh, it just happened. Like, nobody's just going to accept things just happening completely contingently, without an explanation. But if you want to know, even if you have one billiard ball hit the other billiard ball and it rolls across, then you would say, well, what's the principle? If you apply the principle of sufficient reason, then in terms of explanation of how one causes the other ball, you knock one ball and the other ball rolls away, the complete explanation would involve the entire nature of reality if it was a complete explanation, right? So, but the principle of sufficient reason just means nothing happens purely by accident ever. There's always got to be an explanation for it. So when you use the word cause, if you think in terms of the word explanation, how did that happen? And if somebody came along and said, it just happened, well, that's not satisfying. Like, there's no way someone's going to simply accept that, oh, the ball just started to roll along. What's the problem? What do you need an explanation for that? It's just, it just wouldn't happen, right? So that's what in general, the sense of the principle of sufficient reason simply means there's got to be an explanation for everything that happens, or an explanation for everything that has being or existence in the world. Go ahead, David.
David?
I could see using the principle of sufficient reason for explaining every occurrence or event, as you said earlier, Robert. I don't know that it's necessary to have that in the case of existence of stuff. So, you look at billiard balls and you say, how come that's moving? Well, it's because of another billiard ball. But why do the billiard balls exist? Why does the universe exist? That I don't think it's a categorical mistake to be talking about sufficient reason when it comes to the entire universe itself, I believe.
Well, I think that Patrick made a very good point there. If you want an explanation for the world, well, you can't have a cause outside of the world because the world includes everything.
But
So
do
the
you
only way
indeed-
that you could offer an explanation for the world is that it caused itself. It is itself the cause of
But
itself.
you're assuming you have to come up with a cause for existence. You can come up with causes for the configuration of existence and how it changes, but I think it's not applicable to existence itself. Talking about causes, existence is
David,
brute.
could I say that many people agree with you that the trouble with the principle of sufficient reason is that if you push it to its limits, you find that it has very strange consequences. So theologians, who were the ones who originally invoked it, usually try to find some way of curtailing it. They want to appeal to some version of the principle of sufficient reason to prove that God exists. But if the principle is pushed to its limits, if you start applying it to the universe as a whole, you find that it has very strange consequences. There are things called principle of plenitude, which says that everything that is possible is actually realized, or necessitarianism, which says that everything that is actual is necessary and could not be otherwise. Those apparently are consequences of the principles of sufficient reason, which no theist in his right mind wants to take on board. So
I'm not a theist, so it all sounds good to
I'm
me.
just saying, when people invoke the principle of sufficient reason, they usually try to corral it in such a way as to prevent it from having strange consequences, which Spinoza is going to explore. We'll see it in book one. Both of these things are going to come up. The principle of plenitude.
Neither of those two reasons.
And hedging out at the beginning on existence is sort of saying you're not interested in that issue, but it may be an important issue among the many other things, like why is it green? Why does it exist? This may be a significant question.
I think David's point is that it's perfectly reasonable to ask of some finite phenomenon, why is it this way and not that way? That scientific enterprise could not get off the ground if we didn't believe that we could, in principle, find answers to those questions. But when you try and apply it on the universal scale and ask questions like, why is there something rather than nothing, then it does have very strange consequences. We'll see this as we go into book one.
But Patrick, the two consequences.
We ahead of ourselves to
but Patrick, the two consequences that you noted of principle of sufficient reason, to me, they sound realistic. They don't sound odd at all.
Well, to me too. But I actually don't. Sorry, David. After thinking about these for a long time, I believe that they are correct, but not as a result of an invocation of the principle of reason. But this is something.
Okay. I think we better move on.
What were the two? Principle of plenitude, and what was the other one?
It's called necessitarianism. The idea that everything that is actual is necessary.
I'm a necessitarian myself.
Yeah, well, so am I. And so it's
okay. So let's move on. Let's move on, please. I'm going to take over here for a moment.
Okay, go ahead.
So David, cause of itself. I finally formulated an answer to your question, and that is you can understand it as an essence, the essence of a thing, as being the cause of the thing itself. The essence brings it into existence. But of course, it's eternal, so it's always in existence, right? It just means that it's essential to the thing, and therefore, of necessity, we have an eternal thing, right?
Yeah, and I think the essence.
Why in that case couldn't you have something that its essence is to exist for a moment and then stop?
I don't know about, but essence can also involve
I
other.
don't know whether you can have that, David.
Well,
Because
why,
if it's
why are we logically ruling that out? You said it must be eternal. The essence is it's existing at some point. That's all it does. That was its essence.
yeah, but an essence is something that cannot come to a thing and then go away from it. It's always
Yes.
it's essential to the thing. If it did not have that essence, it would not be that thing.
So,
You
so
know?
it's its
But the
essence is
essence-
its actuality being finite. Other than
I
that,
can't imagine an essence of that kind.
Yeah.
Okay.
That could be solipsism, David.
Don't forget, essence can
Something
be
about us.
the essence of something can be many different things, not just existence. It says it involves existence, but it can also have other characteristics of that essence. One of the things being existence, and the other things being doing what it does.
If you had a thing with the essence for existence, and it of necessity existed, and then at the same time you would say it was also essential to this thing that it should only exist for a certain period of time, then you would violate the principle of non-contradiction. I'm relying on Leibniz here. You know, you violate the principle of non-contradiction, and you couldn't have essences that contradict one another, because essences is the very nature of the thing. It's what is essential to the thing. If you take it away, it stops being the thing, you know.
But David's point is that not everything has to be eternal. You could have something that whose essence says it exists for 10 minutes and that's it. There's no ruling that out.
I think that's wrong, but I can't stop now because I want to move on to the, you know, I was actually going to try to do the first 7 propositions, and we spent like close to an hour here on the first definition. So I hope they're not all as difficult as this. That thing is said to be finite in its own kind, that can be limited by another of the same nature. For example, a body is called finite because we can always conceive another that is greater. Thus, a thought is limited by another thought, but a body is not limited by a thought, nor a thought by a body. Okay, so we're talking about anything that of its own kind, it can be limited, right? So you can always think of, you know, the traditional thing in Descartes, for example, is that, you know, regardless of how big this number is, you can always think of a greater number, right? So therefore, it's in the nature of numbers that they should be subject to limit, right? And it can only, the other important thing, obviously, is that it can only be limited of something that is the same as it. You know, numbers can only be limited by numbers, bodies can only be limited by greater bodies, and minds can only be limited by like thought can only be limited by thought. So the notion that, you know, you could use your thought to place a limit or affect anything that is a extended substance is incoherent, right? That'd be like saying I can use my mind to bend spoons or something along those lines, you know. Go ahead, Daniel.
Doesn't that sort of indicate that he accepts Descartes' dualism? I mean, that's what I read in D2.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Descartes fudged that whole problem, you know, like how does my mind affect my body, and how do I feel effects in my mind through my body when the body is extended substance and the mind is not extended substance, but simply thinking and activity. How does one affect the other? And he resorted to the pineal gland, right, which is, you know, just a completely dissatisfying explanation, but nevertheless, that's what Descartes did. And Spinoza won't allow for that. You want to talk about how Spinoza relates to Descartes? That's one of the things that's absolutely fundamental to Spinoza's project, is that just as Descartes pointed out, a mind is an unextended substance. Thinking is essential to the substance that is a mind, and it is unextended. A body is an extended substance. It takes up space. The mind's not in space, doesn't have a place in space. So how can the body possibly affect the mind, or the mind the body? Spinoza said they can't, period. You know, and everything that Descartes tried to do to resolve this problem was an error, because he couldn't accept his own fundamental principles, Descartes, apparently. So go ahead, David R. Somebody, David
Yep.
R.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, I thought Spinoza was a monist, not a dualist. You know,
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to
but
that.
this D2 seems to indicate that he thought there was two different things, as Daniel, I think it was, yeah, Daniel just said. It seems like he's a dualist, and yet, as far as I know, he was always a monist. So,
Yeah.
avoid the problem.
This may have to do
but
with the
perhaps I could just say a word there.
This may have to do with the appearance of things being limited, which is different from their existence. It's our conception of them being limited. Maybe that's the sense in which they're finite. So it's not about their ontology, that, you know, they're dual or not dual or whatever. It's only a definition of finite.
But
Yeah.
it seems like he's talking ontologically.
It
Seems, but
does,
maybe
but
not.
we cannot ever forget that even though he's speaking about what is apparently ontology, he's referring here now to definitions and pure concepts, purely rational concepts, not making any actual reference to anything that has independent ontological being of any kind, okay? These are definitions. So he's just introducing the use of terms, language here, okay? So,
Could I just interject just to answer David that Spinoza will resolve this in favor of monism eventually. Okay, what he will say is that there is only one substance which has two attributes, namely mind and matter, which are just two different ways of looking at the same thing. That's the answer he will eventually give, but that's a long way in the future.
yes, and the way that I prefer to do it is to allow for that suspension of, you know, like you don't want to, you want to follow the mode of the exposition because you will apprehend with greater clarity the necessity of a single substance if you take something into consideration, like the fact that a body cannot affect thought and thought cannot affect a body. All right, so that's really very important, at least to me. So so if we figured that out, we know that, right? It's pretty straightforward. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, so when this may be about what you just talked about. He's talking about things being finite. He's going to talk about attributes. And in attributes, he says what the intellect perceives. Is all of this about intellect saying it exists, not about its actually existing? It's what is intellect making out of everything, right? Okay, because what can we talk about? What is the intellect capable of? Is as much a question as what does it mean exist? That's like a different level of question. Okay, so the ontology and the knowing are different. Okay.
Yeah. So right from the beginning, his definition is what I understand, right? A thing is said to be finite, you know, by substance I understand, by attribute I understand what the intellect perceives of a substance, right? So all these things are really very important. As a matter of fact, we should, number 3 is pretty simple, okay? Okay, first of all, there's just a little bit, I'm sure that most of you know this already, but in the case of Descartes, every single person has one substance at least, and that is their mind. And it is a thinking substance. We all know this, right? And that's the foundation for his ontology. You cannot deny that we have a mind and that it has the capacity to think, and it's thinking all the time. And that forms a singular, autonomous, individual substance, right? We also have a body, right? And that is something, a substance that is entirely different from the substance that is our mind. But for Descartes, there are as many substances, at least, as there are human beings thinking. And there is at least as many human bodies as there are human thought substances that are thinking, right? There's always a body for a mind. So there's a multitude of substances. There's an infinity of substances, really, when you think about spirits, like disembodied spirits. So that's really important because we're going to see something kind of really interesting unfold from that. Why did I bring up Descartes here now? Just give me a moment. Oh, yes, this is why Descartes uses the scholastic explanation for the nature of the world. And what he does is, in the case of Aristotle, Aristotle talks about substances that have attributes and modes, right? And so a mode is an effect of a substance. Now, Aristotle's use of the distinction between substance and modifications of substances is very complex, much more so than Descartes. So I'm going to stick to Descartes. In the case of Descartes, what he's saying is that you have a certain attributes, and they have to be attributed to a subject, and that is the substance. The substance itself cannot be attributed to another thing. It is an independent entity of its own. Just in the same way, my mind is not part of somebody else's mind. It's not part of another thing. It is the ultimate subject of attribution. All effects are affectations of my mind. So I have a mind, which is the fundamental substance. An idea is a modification of that mind, right? And also, every single substance in Descartes has a principal attribute, a singular principal attribute. One thing distinguishes it. In the case of Descartes, for the mind, we're thinking. Thinking is that essential attribute for a mind, is thinking. For the body, the essential attribute, you have to have this if you're a material substance, and that is extension in space, right? Now, what's interesting for Descartes is, as I just pointed out, a mind is not extended in space, and a body doesn't think. Okay, so they're radically different. But the most important thing to remember is that the mind has a singular principal attribute, and that is thinking. The body, its principal attribute, its essential attribute, it always has this, and that's extension in space. All right, so just to get that out of the way.
Robert, are you using affect and attribute as synonyms?
No, I'm not. But
Okay, so
we're getting ahead of.
Okay, because you did use that word affect, like thoughts. Okay.
Okay, well, this is the way that I understand it. Substance is the that's the thing, the subject itself, substance. Thinking is the essential attribute. Thinking is the essential attribute. A thought is a modification of thinking. A thought is a modification of thinking, and the thinking needs a substance. You just can't have thinking wandering around the universe without, so it has a substance, and that's your mind, right? And
David, I just added clarification there. Spinoza talks about modifications of substance, or affections of substance, or modes of substance. All of those three things are interchangeable. But he doesn't use affect and affection interchangeably. Affect comes much later.
Yeah. This does get a little bit complex. So we got to take this one step at a time, because there's a number of different things about attributes and their relations to modes that we're not going to take it all in at once, because it would just become too complex, So we'll just take it one step at a time now. So the most important thing is substance, essential attribute. If you're talking substance, it's got to have that attribute. If you remove all the essential attributes from substance, substance is gone. It's just gone. It would not have any being whatsoever in the world if you remove those essential attributes. But it might not be subject to modification at all. It might not be affected at all. Actually, I have to already just say that never ever happens in the world. But nevertheless, it seems possible that it would not happen in the world. But it never ever. There's always some modification going on in the world. Go ahead, Nick.
Nick, would you like to speak?
Yeah, thanks. Just one observation and then one follow-up question. The observation is that we seem to be doing the live reading now, right? Is that design? Because the original plan in the meetup was to do.
No, we're not doing a live reading. We're not doing a live. We're talking about it.
Well, Nick, we were, I guess, more optimistic or more ambitious in what we thought we would cover. We expected, in fact, that for the first meeting, we would do definitions, axioms, and the first 6 propositions. Obviously, it's not working out that way. We're just going to have to play it by ear and see how this evolves. So it'll take some definite form eventually, but now we're just exploring the possible ways of delving into this. So go ahead, Robert. I think I would like to suggest that you dive into the definition of God, but David wants to.
Yeah, Patrick, I mean, I don't know, here's my question about what you and Robert are saying, and I don't really think it's bad we're taking time at the beginning, and here's why. If you're doing mathematics and you don't get the definitions right at the beginning, the rest of it is gobbledygook, it's meaningless. You know, you can have a little off at the beginning because you're going to refine them as you go. But if we don't get this,
well, I'll tell you, my experience of Spinoza is that it takes many iterations to get the concepts straight. So we'll just do the best we can.
Yeah, I just want to quickly make a comment here.
Yeah.
We can still nevertheless get a good general grasp on things like, for example, substance without having the profound conception. You know what I mean? Like we can get a good ground, a pretty good grasp in a very good general sense of what substance means without delving into the infinite complexity of the problems that emerge eventually, because otherwise that's when things just fall completely to pieces. So I'm aiming tonight at ensuring that everyone sort of get a good general sense of what we're driving at here, what Spinoza is driving at. Go ahead, Nick. What did you want to have to say?
Nick, did you?
Yeah, thanks. Patrick, you want to say something?
No, not me. Did you want to say something?
Okay, yes, I do.
Go ahead.
I want to follow up to the earlier clarification you made to David S., which is, I think I thought I heard that you said that Spinoza used attribute and affections interchangeably. Now, if that's
what I said, he uses mode, modification, and affection interchangeably.
Got you.
Okay.
And then the question, I think, okay, fine. Then the question originally raised by David S. still remains with me. Is there any connection or not of attributes and affections?
So the hierarchy, if you like, is substance, attribute, mode. Okay, he's going to tell us eventually that there is only one substance which has infinitely many attributes, and in each attribute there are infinitely many modes or modifications or affections. That's the terminological landscape that he's going to fix on. Does that answer the question?
It does very well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Because yeah, that's really all you need to know now, you know. So I'm determined I'm at least going to get through the definitions tonight. So I think the last point that David raised, that we are talking about concepts here. It's rationalist philosophy. He's not making reference of, he's not depending on the referential value, the veridical value of any of the terms that he's using here. He's just talking about, I want you to understand these ideas in this way, and these terms in this way. Okay, so but you're absolutely right. This is extraordinary definition number 4, because he says by attribute, and for Spinoza, you can just take it for granted we're talking about an essential attribute. Okay, in other words, it's an attribute. If you were to remove that attribute, the thing would not be the same substance at all. It's absolutely essential for a human being to be thinking. If it stops thinking, no longer a human being. Okay, so that's an essential attribute. By attribute, I understand what the intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. Now, let's deal with this this is a very interesting point that Patrick drew my attention to, and that is that the Latin doesn't have articles. So this word here, the, should not be there, and neither should an, and any given attribute. Now, I don't think it is important at all whether there is a distinction made between the divine intellect, a individual human intellect, intellect per se, intellect qua intellect. All of these terms, all of those understandings of the word here, intellect, are perfectly correct in this definition. So, and that's what Spinoza gives us in the Latin. He doesn't say, by attribute I understand what the intellect perceives, nor does he say an intellect. He says, by attribute I understand what intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. That's precisely what Spinoza says, and that's precisely what is required for the proper definition. If you introduce an individual mind or the mind of God or anything else, you're already sort of occluding the clarity of the definition. And it seems incredible to me that these people could make such a stupid mistake. But nevertheless, let's just read this note and we'll get an understanding of what I'm getting at here. The meaning of this definition is much disputed. One important question of the translation is whether tanquam should be, I don't have Latin, by the way, should be rendered as if or as, like as if this is what the intellect perceives of a substance as if constituting its essence or as constituting its essence, right? And so I'll just read the rest of the note and we can talk about it. One important question of the translation is whether tanquam should be rendered as if or as. The former would favor those who hold the subjective interpretation, according to which the differences between the attributes are illusory, all the attributes being identical in substance. So the sense is that that's the subjective, okay? I'll just continue with the note. The latter would be more congenial to those who think the attributes are really distinct and not merely constructions of the intellect, right? And I think that Giraud, this is Curley's note, by the way, in his edition, I think that Giraud has provided us with a definitive refutation of the subjective interpretation, but it is still unclear whether his own interpretation is acceptable. Arguably, the intellect referred to in this definition is the infinite intellect and not the finite. And then this is the NS is a Dutch translation they did of Spinoza's collected works, and they provide the definite article for substance. And here we have, instead of using the word a substance or the substance, all that is required in this definition is, by attribute I understand what intellect perceives of substance as constituting its essence. That is the correct definition. Introducing articles of any kind just make a mess of it, right? So that's my view of the matter. I don't know what anybody else thinks about it. To say as if or as would imply that somehow substance, the very nature of substance, would depend on the intellectual perception, as if the nature of substance depended on how perfectly well intellect perceives the substance, which just brings in a whole bunch of really ridiculous nonsense. But go ahead, Dave.
Well, yeah, it's an innocent question. It's a little goofy, but so we're talking about essence, and we haven't said what we mean by essence. That comes from the verb to be. It's an assertion about being, or it seems here to be saying the intellectual nature of something when it's grasped by the intellect. So is that its being? Or essence is like what fundamentally about it, whether it exists or not, is the way you're thinking of it. What is there, I kind of get a feeling, but what is it giving us for free that's slipped in here? It exists now because it has an essence. It exists as real or actual or potential or in some mode of possibility, but all those have essence. Is that true?
Okay, well,
Could
first
I
of all,
say
he's defining the word attribute, his use of the word attribute, right? So that's we can't lose sight of that. His definition, he says, when I use the word attribute, what I mean to say is that there is the intellect perceives something of the substance that constitutes its essence. And the way that I understand the force of the word essence here is definition, of course, but also more importantly, an essential attribute. Like you can't remove that attribute without changing the nature of the substance altogether. So that's what I understand. It seems to me that generally speaking, when what Spinoza would say is, when I offer a definition of the substance, I enumerate its essential attributes. That's my definition. Its essential attributes forms its definition. I just have to number them, and now you know what it is. And
Definition, yeah, definitional for a substance. So it's sort of like what the truth of what is that substance. So
yeah,
it's
yeah,
part of a definition, which sounds intellectual, but
yeah. But you see, this is the way that I would. The more I thought about it, because I was aware of the fact that Latin didn't have the articles, but I didn't understand it at first when I realized just how crazy this is to put these articles in here. Look at this. By attribute, I understand what intellect perceives of substance as constituting its essence. It's perfect, just like that.
you're right. You're right. Yeah, it's much better.
But instead, we have to look at this. We're all going to stick to the same translation, because otherwise it'll just be kind of incoherent, our discussions. So here we get to this different kinds of modes now that Nick brought up, and again, they're pretty straightforward here. By mode, I understand the affections of a substance, right? Okay, so in a sense, he's talking, Spinoza doesn't refer to a modification of a single attribute of a substance, but it goes straight to substance. But that's perfectly coherent, because the substance is constituted by its essential attributes. So if you have an affection of a substance, then of necessity is going to be an affection of any essential attribute it has, right? And by mode, I understand the affections of a substance, or that which is in another, through which it is also conceived. And here we have conception. It's all about how do we understand this, right? And why doesn't somebody else offer an explanation of what he's getting at here?
Okay, let me try, Robert. It's already implicit in this sequence of definitions that the intellect is going to be one of the attributes of God. Okay, so whereas Descartes, as far as I remember, for him, a substance is just a thing that exists independently of other things. But Spinoza has added in this extra phrase, like I don't see it in front of me, but not only is it in itself, but it is to be conceived in itself. Okay, so not only he's already alluding to the two attributes that he's going to use, the attribute of extension and the attribute of thought. So again, in 5, you see the modification in the attribute of extension, and modification is just a physical object, but in the attribute of thought, it's an idea, the idea of the object. So he's just foreshadowing what he's eventually going to land.
Patrick, that may be true. That may be true. But
what I'm saying simply, Robert, is that we can't understand what's going on here until we know eventually what's going on later. And the only thing I'm just flagging is that we don't know yet what Spinoza is talking about. I think you agree with me.
Isn't that a very
It's just pure
non-geometric?
concepts.
Isn't that a very non-geometric, anti-Euclidean way to read the elements of Euclid, to say, you won't know until I do the parallel, the construction of the triangle, which has an acute angle, what I really mean by parallel, right? Won't that
Yeah,
really be?
but David, if you've ever read any mathematics, you know that you can't understand it on the first pass. You have to go back to the beginning several times. It's exactly the same with Spinoza.
Yeah, but wait a minute. I want to be clear on the point that you originally made now, Patrick. It seemed to me that you were saying that given the fact that it involves understanding and conception, that somehow that implied that Spinoza was already taking it for granted that the essential attribute of thinking was part of the substance.
Oh, yes.
But another,
But he's not going to spell this out until book 2, basically.
yeah, but what I don't understand is why you think that we should attribute the essential attribute of thinking to substance in order to understand this definition.
No, I didn't say that. I'm saying you can understand it as a concept, okay, as an abstraction, okay, without knowing where Spinoza is going to go with it. But you can't understand what he's talking about unless you know that he's eventually going to say there is one substance that has infinitely many attributes, of which 2 are known to us, which he calls attribute of thought and the attribute of extension. And he's going to eventually tell us that the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things.
Yeah.
That the 2 attributes exist in perfect parallelism. Okay.
Yes. All these things are true, Patrick. But what my question is focused strictly on, I want to confine my question to something very specific. Wait till I ask my question, Patrick.
I'm not attempting to answer your question. I'm attempting to answer questions that have been raised by David, by Daniel, by the 2 Davids, and by Daniel. That's all. That's all.
Okay, but what this is the point that I want to make in response to what you just said. I think that we can form a perfectly clear understanding of this definition without knowing anything about the stuff that comes subsequent to this definition.
Well, I think everyone needs to make that judgment call for himself.
Okay. In my humble opinion, what he's doing is offering definitions that do not rely on a general understanding of his ontology at all. It's just, this is what he says. He's saying, when I use the word mode, what I mean is an affection of a substance.
That's right.
And a mode, because it's an affection of a substance, can only be properly conceived through that substance. In other words, if I want to talk about something like a material substance, well, then I have to understand that material substance as being, I have to understand it as being something that is extended. Otherwise, it depends on the essential attribute of extension. Otherwise, material substance would be an incoherent thought, right? You couldn't talk about a material substance that didn't occupy space. Or if you like, in the case of an idea, I want to talk about an idea. Well, at the same time, I don't want to introduce the essential attribute of thinking. Well, someone can say, what kind of an idea if you don't have thinking? You have to have thinking if you have an idea. You have to have something like, let's just call it a mind before you can have an idea. So you and I are at odds when it comes to the mode of exposition, Patrick, and I don't believe you have to know anything in advance.
You're in charge, so go ahead. But if somebody asks a question, I will attempt to answer it if I think I have an answer that will be helpful.
Oh, sure, by all means. But again, to return to the original point, if you think of Euclid as being the model, he doesn't say, okay, I'm going to introduce a term here, and I'm just going to take it for granted that you already know all of the geometrical forms that I'm going to create out of this principle. He says, this is the principle, period. You don't need any supporting evidence. It's self-sufficient as a definition.
Yeah,
It doesn't rely on a general understanding of anything. So go ahead, David, and then
Yeah,
Nick.
Rob, Patrick, for example, I think I wrote this, I'll read what I wrote as a note. By precluding our freely developing this understanding in forward steps through Spinoza's own definitions, we're creating a possible limitation of the way we can understand, ultimately apply his concepts as generally as possible. For example, let's say there's a third mode he didn't even think of, and we realize that while we're working, other than thinking material, like there's a third, oh my God, then we can proceed to understand how we would apply his principles and definitions in that area. The analogy with Euclid. There's certain properties that triangles have, which will carry over outside of Euclidean geometry, because we've learned what the substantial rules are about lines. Even if we violate some other postulates, we can carry those forwards in terms of minimal distance and things like that. So saying it can only mean this can be a limiting thing. That's all I'm saying, Patrick. We run the risk, not that we're going to outthink Spinoza, but it feels constricting. I mean, I appreciate the answer, but sometimes I think, Robert, we do need that specific. Well, it's going to turn out easy, folks, like this. Don't worry your little heads. That can be helpful too. So I go both ways on this. Thanks.
Oh yeah, that's fine. I mean, generally speaking, I don't object fundamentally to going ahead to propositions that show up in the future, or anything else like definitions or axioms that show up in the future. I don't have a problem with that, but I think that what we really ought to understand is that the definitions that are offered here are self-sufficient. You don't need to know anything else because it's just a term.
Well, it's not for most people. I mean, you alluded at the beginning to the exchange between Spinoza and the study group, okay, precisely on this question. Okay, the study group, who were the first readers of Spinoza's ethics, they couldn't understand his definitions.
Well, I don't have an explanation of why they had this difficulty. I don't know. Just this. I just don't understand. Anyway, Nick, go ahead. And then Roger.
Yeah, thanks. I have an observation to contribute to this conversation, and then I have a follow-up question to Patrick. I think on this debate, I come down closer to Patrick rather than David and Robert, even though both sides have merits. And I draw this mainly because I have read the first two chapters of Harry Wolfenson's book. And for those who, it was nicely linked in the meetup announcement. Harry Wolfenson is the scholar, medieval scholarship and Spinoza, etc. And he had devoted 2 chapters, first and second, to this very question: why the hell he wrote in terms of geometric proof. And the long and short of it, based on my reading, that it's not really essential that Spinoza happened to choose this form of exposition. And he really did not mean to write the ethics in a way that Euclides wrote elements, not a bit of it. It was just some very, very unique historical reasons that this book ended up the way it's written. Therefore, try to, and Wolfenson pointed out, a lot of those definitions, propositions, axioms are not really what we understand as Euclidean elements, that one follows precisely after another. It's not really that, but it's just, whatever the way that happens to be on Spinoza's mind, he put together in that fashion. So in that sense, it would be very difficult for first-time reader like me to actually go from page 1 to page whatever. But I take the point that we ought to follow some logical sequence and suspend the judgment on certain concept and may revisit it once we get closer to the later exposition, whatever. So that was my observation. But my question to Patrick was, in your explanation, you mentioned two concepts for attributes. One is extension, the other is thought. So just briefly, without getting into details, when did he start to talk about that? And eventually we might understand what he meant by attributes.
I just let me say that I would definitely second your suggestion of looking to Wolfson in order to understand the obscure passages in particularly in book 1, but the attributes, it's going to take to the end of book 2 before he fully develops the theory of the attributes. He develops it first in book 1 with regard to God. He's going to say that God has attributes of thought and extension. So for Spinoza, he's going to explain that the material world, which is God under the attribute of extension, and God under the attribute of thought is, well, something like the realm of Platonic ideals. But he's going to say that they are one and the same substance, two ways of looking at the same thing.
Okay. I can't bait my breath any longer.
Let me just answer the next question. And then in book 2, he's going to say the same thing of the human being. He's going to say that the human mind is the idea of the human body. That it's the same thing looked on now under the attribute of thought, now under the attribute of extension. And this is going to be his answer to Cartesian dualism. But this is going to take all of the first 2 books of the Ethics to spell out. Does that answer the question, Nick?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to I was trying to interrupt there, and that is because I really just don't think that people should understand Wolfson as being the authority on Spinoza. I mean, there has been a century now of a fundamental refutation of many of the positions that Wolfson adopted towards Spinoza. Some people just say he's got it all wrong altogether wrong. So don't take Wolfson as being the ultimate authority by any stretch, okay? And I think in this terms of his subjective interpretation of the essence of an attribute, he's definitely wrong. It's not a subjective limited mind that's involved here. Anyway, Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I feel that Patrick's point is warranted for 2 reasons. One is that we're not all versed in Spinoza or philosophy, in my case, in general. So, and throwing at us a bunch of definitions and trying to belabor each one to death or exhaustively at this stage is not really helpful. We need to go through the definitions, but we need to see the overall picture. I mean, if you're going to build a structure, you need to see what the structure is like before you go through the series of steps and instructions. And so the overall picture is very important. And that's why we may, I mean, as Patrick put it, we have to go back and belabor those definitions once again. This is one reason. The other reason is that the definition and the understanding of Spinoza back then in the 1600s is no longer the same in some uh, instances like what we understand today. My understanding of a mode, for instance, is probably very different from what Spinoza understood it. And so for me, a mode is a basic building block, like a sine wave of a certain frequency. Then you take another wave of double that frequency, triple that These are different modes that you use to build, to represent a signal. That's what signal processing is about. So when I look at what Spinoza is trying to say, I really have to struggle to put myself back in that century 500 years ago and try to understand his perspective. So these are the two difficulties I have from my perspective.
Okay, we understand what you said, Roger. For me, a rational concept is just exactly the same conception for me as it was for anybody else at any other point in time in history. If it's an adequate definition, it's the same concept. A mode is a mode. What we want to know is what Spinoza, when he uses the term mode, what he's referring to. And I think that it's perfectly easy to form a clear conception. As far as the overview, you're talking about the overview. I've been through the ethics and I've worked really hard on it. And I can tell you, and I'm speaking personally now, that I think that the order of exposition is absolutely crucial for a proper understanding. And also to refer again now to respond to, I just recalled Nick, you talked about the geometrical method, that it was just the form. It's just the form. It doesn't involve the content. I think that the form, the geometrical exposition that Spinoza uses is essential to the content. It changes the nature of the thought altogether. So I'm at odds with a lot of opinions that are being expressed here, and I don't agree with them, with very many of them at all. Okay.
Can I just suggest that we're just feeling our way into this? This is our first meeting. We don't know what form we will eventually settle on. So, and we don't have to. I mean, it's good that we have at least understood that the richness of the material requires that we explore how best to communicate what the ideas are. It's not obvious. I mean, as you know, Robert, and as I know from experience, most attempts to read the ethics just fail. Okay, attempts to read it collectively. And what we're trying to do is figure out a way that we can get on board to actually pursue this thing through its end.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know what the answer is at this point, but why is that a problem? We'll work it out as we go along. We've already got, 3 people committed to lead the first 3 meetings. Okay, and there are going to be 3 very different styles, and we'll see how it works out in each of those 3 cases, and that will hopefully give us the momentum that we need to continue this exploration. But it's just an exploration. So what I'd like to suggest now is that we finish the discussion of the definitions, because we only have like 20 minutes left in the 2 hours that are allotted. And then if you like, Robert, you can start on the axioms next time, or I will take it up next time.
Okay, we'll decide that at the end of this meeting. But Nick, you had something to say?
Let's just finish the discussion of the definitions.
Okay, so Nick, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something else?
I did, but I think it might hold up the flow. So
let's just see what your question. Make your remark, and we'll decide whether it'll hold things up.
All right, 30 seconds. I think we could borrow from the success of reading Leibniz. So, we've gone through most of the year. I finished the book. I think I get a sense of progress and learning. So I think one of the key things for that is because we relied on a very good secondary literature. It's not just original text, which is very dense by itself. And anybody anywhere could have their opinions from left and right. But we had a writer, so Reicher had a sort of the way of commenting, bring out the insights from it. We can disagree, we can agree, whatever, but we stick to it. So in that sense, it got us through. I think, Leibniz, the Spinoza, you look at the text, very dense, 16th century, 17th century, written in Latin, a lot of stuff going on, which is not up to date today. And if we try to interpret all from our original individual perspective, some versed in this, some first-time reader, then it's hard to see that coming to convergence. Yeah.
Okay. Listen, in response to what you were saying, I don't have a problem with commentary. I'm just simply saying that Wolfson is one extreme position, and since he wrote his book, a lot of people have made really solid arguments against his position. Like there's no consensus on a lot of these things, but Wolfson, he wouldn't be the first critic that I would read. Let me put it that way, okay? It's as important as Wolfson is in the history of the
You're cutting off, Robert. We can't hear you.
I know. What I was just saying was that, Wolfson is not the ultimate authority. There's a great deal of people who have argued very effectively against his position, and you certainly shouldn't just rely on Wolfson alone as a commentator on Spinoza's ethics. That is certain. And the other thing is that what's really important to me is that in our reading is that we don't have to, first of all, it's easily comprehended. It's easily understood. It's complex, the ethics. It's complex. It's lots of really fine details involved. But in terms of the ideas, they're not really philosophically sort of hard to grasp. It's pretty straightforward. But anyway, that's my view. Okay, so I'll just quickly now try to finish these definitions. I think we'll have to leave the axioms till the next meeting. And I don't even know where we were. Did I do 6? No, I didn't do 6. Okay. So by God, I understand a being absolutely infinite. It has a substance consisting of an infinity of attributes, of which each one expresses an eternal and infinite essence. Okay, so we're talking about attributes that are eternal and infinite, right? And because they are eternal and infinite, they express an essence that is infinite, and that makes it an absolutely infinite substance. Pretty straightforward. There's one thing that's quite interesting here, of course, and that is, he explains it here in the exposition, so I'll read the exposition here. I say absolutely infinite, not infinite in its own kind, for if something is only infinite in its own kind, we can deny infinite attributes of it. Thus, we can conceive infinite attributes which do not pertain to its nature. But if something is absolutely infinite, whatever expresses essence and involves no negation pertains to its essence. So in other words, if we're talking about an attribute and it's infinite, involves no negation whatsoever, in other words, that there is no hinge upon the attribute of thinking, let's say. Nothing can prevent thinking from thinking except other thinking, right? So no negation can be, there's no way that thinking can be qualified by anything other than thinking. The only thing that can stop one thought is another thought. And so in that sense, they are in that sense, it's infinite. That's what makes thinking infinite. And anything that is infinite in that sense, if it's an infinite attribute, in other words, then it pertains to God, because God is absolutely infinite. That means that there is no infinite attribute that does not belong to God. Of necessity, it belongs to God. Because if it didn't belong to God, that would mean that God would only be infinite in his own kind, right? But he's not infinite in his own kind. He's absolutely infinite. So that means he involves all the essential infinite attributes, right? And there's an infinity of them, which is kind of interesting because we don't know anything about the other attributes other than extension and thinking. That's all we know. We don't know. There's an infinity of other attributes, and they're completely mysterious. It's important, though, that they still be there. It's kind of interesting that there are some things that can be known about these infinite attributes, this infinity of other infinite attributes. There's some things that can be known, but not very much, unfortunately. And then
I say something there? Something I learned from Wolfson about this. That first of all, that his definition of God is almost word for word the same as a definition that's to be found in the rabbinical theological literature. The major difference is what he means by the word attribute. So, in the traditional theology, God had many different attributes like goodness and power and will and intellect. Spinoza is also going to say eventually that God has infinitely many attributes, but he is then going to say that there are only two of them which are accessible to us. But the reason why I think this is interesting is that I believe that Spinoza is drawing on a theological doctrine called the doctrine of divine simplicity, which says that God does not have any parts. What we think of as separate parts of God, like will and power and intellect and so on, are just artifacts of the human intellect, according to the theological doctrine of divine simplicity. And apparently, this is the way that Spinoza thinks of the attributes, that they're just two different or infinitely many different ways of looking at one and the same substance.
Okay, that's one interpretation. I don't believe that the distinctions between the attributes rely on our perspective, our limited perspective or something, or our understanding, or how we have separated essential attributes into different kinds despite the unity of God and all those things. I'm not sure whether that's true. That's just one way of understanding it, a perfectly valid way of understanding it, but I don't think that it's gospel. Okay, so David, go ahead.
Yeah. Two things, I think. One, I want to ask Patrick what source specifically you would be referring to when you're talking about rabbinic sources. And second of all, this follows the Rambam, the Moses ben Maimon, the 1100s sort of intellectual summarizer of traditions, laws, and understanding. And he would shun the use of any attribution of anything to the deity, saying that is an
Okay.
the more you attribute, the more in error you are. So I was wondering what sources you were.
Well, I believe for the definition of God, this comes from Wolfson. The full Wilson has a 2-volume commentary. It dates to the 1930s, as Robert says, it's out of date, but to understand the rabbinical and scholastic theological influences on Spinoza, this seems to be the go-to source. So Kreskas and Gersonides and all those names mean very little to me. But Wilson knows that entire literature, and he makes the connections between Spinoza's thought and those rabbinical theologians. So if you're interested in going down that rabbit hole, you can find it in Wilson.
Yeah, I know Spinoza is, a Jew and studies that stuff, and so he's aware of that literature. So, the terms when applied in the scriptures that God says, God knows, God is here, God is, has wisdom or knowledge, those are all taken entirely as analogic. They're not literal attributions. So it's like we can't understand the kind of knowledge. So for us, it's just knowledge, or we can't know this kind of wisdom, or we can't understand this sort of relation to things. We call it seeing and hearing, But that's just what humans do. We don't, that's not an attribute that applies to God. So that's just our understanding being applied in words to something we know we don't understand. That's all. So I'm not sure, is this any different from what you're saying, or is this the same as we?
Well, I can only refer you to Wilson. It's, I mean,
all right, well, it's very indirect because I'm just quoting from the primary literature, having read them myself.
Yeah,
so
well, of course I haven't. So all I know about the theological influences on Spinoza is from dipping into Wilson. But Wilson is a huge resource. It's not of any particular interest to me, except to understand where Spinoza is coming from in general terms.
Can I ask a question?
Am I interrupting the conversation? Because it's 10 minutes to, and I want to finish the definitions at least.
Can I just ask one quick thing?
Sure.
Can you explain what it means in its own kind? I'm sort of, I sense what he means by it, but I'm not sure I can put it into words.
Well, a difference in kind would be something that had a different nature, a different essence. So a different kind would be something that is not difference in degree, but kind. It's a,
like Daniel, like Daniel, you can't border a sound with a black, but you can border a blue with a black.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good analogy, actually. Yeah, it's just like that. Different kind of thing. I mean, it's interesting that you should bring that question up, because the nature of kinds in Spinoza is very interesting. How Spinoza would account for kinds of things is very interesting, but we won't know that for a long time. Okay.
Well, I was thinking of the other questions, like how attributes would overlap across different substances and modes across different substances, but I think that should be left for later on, I guess.
Yeah, and one of the most obvious. Okay, you're right. This stuff is going to come up. It's very interesting. So anyway, we understand what Spinoza's concern here. He says, well, when God is absolutely infinite, he just simply means that if you talk about an attribute and it's infinite, it belongs to God. Period. If one were removed from him, then you would have two different kinds of things. You have God be one kind of thing, and what other substance had that other attribute that God did not have, that would be a different kind of thing. So that thing is called free, which exists from the necessity of its nature alone, and is determined to act by itself alone. And but a thing is called necessary, or rather compelled, which is determined by another to exist. and to produce an effect in a certain and determinate manner. Okay, so I very quickly just do an exposition of this because this is all very straightforward stuff, but nevertheless, we know that God, or okay, let's just say that a substance whose essence involves existence, that exists from the necessity of its nature alone. It doesn't depend on anything else to have being, right? And because it has its own being, it is the ground of its own being, then it already it sort of makes it clear that nothing else can determine it. You know what I mean? It's not subject to the determination of something else. And in a way, like it's radically autonomous. Let me put it that way. It's radically autonomous because it brings itself into being. It has its own being, and if its being, whatever its mode of existence may be, nothing can impinge upon that because it's brought itself into being. The only way that something can determine something else is if that thing that has been determined by the something else relies on that something else for its being, and therefore whatever it relies on can affect it in some way, right? It can produce an effect. It can have a causal relation to that thing. And determined, of course, means not anything other than change the nature of it of necessity, right? We're not talking about things like it could happen, but a thing is called necessary or compelled. It means that it suffers an effect from something else which is of necessity, not. There's no contingency here again, it's compelled of necessity by whatever would be the ground for its being. And by eternity, I understand existence insofar as conceived to follow necessarily from the definition alone of an eternal thing. Well, this is just very straightforward. If you're going to talk about eternity, not as a dimension of time, but as having being at all, well, that nature of eternity, insofar as eternity has being, it relies on the existence of something that is an eternal thing. So you have substance, and then as a kind of a consequence of the eternal thing, you can talk about eternity. So in that sense, just like as in Aristotle, time is not fundamental. Change is fundamental. If there were not change, there would be no time. Most people would say, well, unless you had time, you couldn't have change because change takes time. For Aristotle, he would say, no, if you have time, of necessity, that implies that change has transpired. And if you don't have change transpiring, time's gone. It's removed from the picture altogether, right? So in the same way, you have to have an existent thing in order to have eternity. And that thing that exists, because it exists necessarily, is an eternal thing, right? So for such existence, like the essence of a thing, is conceived as an eternal truth. And on that account, cannot be explained by duration or time, even if the duration is conceived to be without beginning or end. So in other words, what he's saying here is, even if you talk about duration that has no beginning and end, it still would not have being. There would be no eternal time going on forever unless you had a thing that had eternal existence. And that essence is understood to be an eternal truth, right? I'm not sure that I'm doing a very good job anymore because I'm getting really tired, but anyway, anybody have any remarks here to make? No more arguments tonight?
Well, I can always offer some if you want.
Sure.
Well, let's see. Can we step back up just a paragraph?
Yeah.
In the display. Can you move up a paragraph? No. Back to the previous definition. So we have. Okay, about D7. Well, I would just add that there is only one free thing in Spinoza's cosmology. That's God. So I mean, once you take that on board, it's quite clear what he's driving at here. For eternity, well, this really doesn't become an issue, I think, as far as I remember, until about book 5, when he's talking about the eternity of the mind. Well, I mean, the eternity of the human mind is probably the most puzzling of Spinoza's doctrines, because I mean the problem, I think it really is a sort of gap in his philosophy, that he doesn't, on the one hand, you have the domain of timeless Platonic ideas, the forms, God under the attribute of thought. And on the other hand, you have the world of becoming under the attribute of extension. And he doesn't clearly explain how you get from the timeless domain into the domain of time. So he seems to follow Plato rather than Aristotle. Aristotle thought of eternity as indefinite duration, whereas for Plato, eternity was literally the absence of time, timelessness. It's the problem. I think he sort of treats time as somehow illusory. I mean, he says in many places that the human mind can't form an adequate idea of the duration of things just because of our finitude. So, when he talks about essence involving existence, that's something that applies only to God. For human beings, their essence, whatever that is, it does not entail existence. The duration or the location of the human mind in duration is somehow, well, he doesn't explain in his philosophy how we sort of fit into the world of becoming. But well, so I just mentioned that eternity really is one of the most difficult things in Spinoza to understand. The definition, I suppose, makes sense in its own terms, but what it's actually pointing to is it's really unclear.
Yeah. Okay. That's all very true. And let me just to finish off here. There's again this whole question of whether or not the definite, the indefinite, or any article at all is appropriate in translation. Here we have a little complication again, but people can look at that note. It appears in the edition that we're using.
You're referring to the eternal thing? Is that what you mean? Yeah. If it's the eternal thing, it must be God. There can't be anything else. I mean, if it's...
I was simply talking about the way the translation from the Latin has been done, so that to include articles is sometimes is a question. So that's why I just had this note at the bottom of this last definition. So let me just say this, okay? On the basis of this first meeting, I just wanted to, there's a couple of things that really concern me. And one of them is trying to grapple with too many of the ideas in advance of the exposition. In my view, I would say, take it one step at a time, one step at a time. That's going to save you a lot of grief. And the other thing is, we should understand what he's dealing with here. These are definitions. He's not making any claims about the being of anything. So that's one thing I should also say. And That's all I have to say on that, on the reading that we've done tonight. Although I have to admit it was a lot more difficult than I
Yeah,
thought it was.
my concern would be that if we adopt your approach, that it's going to take an incalculable amount of time to get through the even just book one. If I was to explain the definitions, I would have just given examples of by looking ahead into. I would have said, look, there's one substance, there are two attributes, and they are called thought and extension. Under the attribute of extension, we have infinitely many modes. They are physical objects. Under the attribute of thought, we have infinitely many modes. They are the ideas of these objects. And that's basically it for the definitions.
Okay, well, I guess what I'm doing, what I'm trying to emphasize.
So what I would like to suggest is that I will try it my way next week, starting from the axioms, and see how much ground I can cover. Okay?
Okay.
For perhaps the axioms and the 7 propositions, if I can get to 7, and just see how quickly I can get through that material.
Sure.
And then on the third meeting, okay, we'll have a third person who's going to obviously have a completely different style from us. Blake, Daniel, you might remember we had a meeting on Spinoza. Yeah, about 18 months ago, and this guy Blake, you might remember him, Blake. Yeah.
If I can dive in, I mean,
let me just say that he has since written a book on Spinoza. Okay, and he's going to come along on the third meeting and pitch his book. So we'll see what his style is. Okay, and then maybe
I think both approaches have value, seriously. And I like, to explicate the definition precisely and also give examples. And these are complicated definitions. And look at the trouble we have with Leibniz. How many months did we spend on monads? They're difficult concepts. So to bounce them around from various approaches, I think is helpful.
Yeah.
So can I recommend, since you're going to try, Patrick, since you suggested trying 2 different approaches, it might be worthwhile trying 2 distinct and different approaches. And then in the third week, get a show of hands on whether or not we feel more comfortable with one or the other, or doing both.
That's my idea. In fact, in the third week, we will have a third approach. That's what I was saying to Daniel. Okay, the way we scheduled it was that Robert would take the first week, I would take the second, and Blake McBride would take the third.
Well, I thought this dialogue was actually helpful, pointed out different things. So I learned from both of you.
Yeah, okay, so we're just learning. We're learning as we go along. And one
of the most important things I think that came up was the whole question of what Spinoza understands by the word cause. And I can tell you that, getting ahead of myself now and ahead of our reading, but ultimately what he understands by cause is, let's just say that any given phenomenon in the natural realm, you say that's an effect, therefore it had a cause, right? Mm-hmm. For Spinoza, what he means by cause is a complete and comprehensive rational explanation. You know what I mean? He's not on the level of sort of somebody who say it was the force. He would say, no, I'm not satisfied with the word force. I want to have a rational form of explanation. So somehow you have to provide me with a complete rational explanation of how force works. What is the nature of force? And that's what I was saying. And the next thing you know, you're involved in the whole universe, the nature of natural law and space and time and everything. All the fundamental dimensions of the world are involved. And so even that is a very complex question. That you see, what I was hoping for was everyone was this. Let's just get a pretty good grasp on these things before we get all tangled up in the complexity of the ideas, because I think that when you see subsequently in the work, in the treatise, the work that these terms do, the work the concepts do actually informs your understanding of the concept. You know what I mean? You see, oh, he uses it to do this. Now I know what the term actually means, so that's something to bear in mind as well.
I'd just like to stress that reading Spinoza is a matter of continually going over the same ground, okay? As you assimilate his concepts and definitions and his stipulated definitions, the way he uses words in idiosyncratic ways. So
Yes.
it's not a linear process at all. At least I don't think that you can sit down with the definitions and axioms and postulates and so on and hope to go through it linearly so that at the end of the one reading you actually understand what Spinoza is on about. My experience, like yours, I've been reading Spinoza on and off for decades. Okay,
I don't think anyone expects to read it straight.
It matures.
No one's saying, I don't think anyone's saying we're going to read it straight through, but just get a grasp at the beginning of what we're climbing.
What Robert and I are hoping to do, okay, is bring this enterprise to a conclusion, okay, where we'll actually go through the entire book over the course of a year. That's roughly the ambition that we have. And as we've sort of said to ourselves, it doesn't really matter how many people stick with us for this enterprise. We would just like to see if we can get through it and have stimulating discussions along the way. So
I just want to quickly say something
obviously
completely
there are going to be
unrelated.
severe differences of opinion, but I'm up
Okay.
for that.
Let me just
It
say
doesn't
something
bother
though.
me.
Let me just say something though. In the notes, Scott just put a reference to a book called the Oxford Handbook to Spinoza by Della Rocca, and it's a good place to understand things like essential attributes, modes, affections, all the fundamentals of of Spinoza's ontology. Okay, so I highly recommend that you look at that book, just for the sake of terminology, if nothing else. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Sorry, go ahead.
Well,
Nick,
I think
everyone
is entitled to their own favorite secondary sources. I would certainly agree with Della Rocca as I think the foremost scholar on the subject. But the more sources, the greater the diversity of opinions we can bring to this, the better. So by all means, bring whatever secondary sources you like to this discussion. Nick, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I look forward to the whole completion of this project. Yeah, but I do have a small follow-up question on D7, D8 when we were just finishing up. So I'm trying to think. This is very important for me because the D7 really is one of the key idea he talked about, the determinism. So did you mean, Patrick, when you explained this, that he's setting up this concept in an anticlimactic way, in a sense that
says, well, yes, of course.
In a sense that here is the definition, but nothing fits except God. So is that the way to understand it, or did I get it wrong? And the second point,
eventually he's going to tell us that God is the only free cause. Okay, that everything else is necessitated, everything is determined. The most forceful statement of this is Proposition 33 in Book 1, where he says that, I think I have it from memory, This is the Elwes translation. Things could not have been brought into being by God in any order or in any manner other than that which has in fact obtained. Nothing could be other than it is. Everything is determined by God. This is the core of Spinoza's metaphysics, and his whole ethics is based on this principle of necessitarianism, which he derives, we'll see, from the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason, of course, it's almost axiomatic for Spinoza, even though he doesn't spell it out in the way that Leibniz does. It really is the basis of his whole philosophy. That's how he sets up the correspondence between the two attributes. Okay, the two attributes are extension and thought. He says for every existent thing, there is a sufficient reason. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between extension and thought.
All right, so Patrick, since you're helpfully explaining things, and how would you just answer the basic question in that case with that model? Why would it make any difference that a human being does any action that would be defined as good or facing towards God? What difference in the entire universe could it possibly make, and why should anyone even think about being good? What is the significance of that?
But do you want me? You want me to justify Spinoza? I'm not.
No. What is his ethics about? Should we be good?
No, he's not talking about morality. He's talking about eudaimonia. Okay, that's the Greek notion of how to live a good life in the sense of human flourishing. He's not concerned with deontology or Kantian ethics, or, I mean, he certainly is concerned with human relations, but it's not his primary concern. He's using ethics in the same sense as the Greeks, the Stoics, the Epicureans, Aristotle.
You know something, I think.
Your choice, yeah. It's not your choice.
David,
that is distinct from the Jewish attribution of responsibility.
Oh, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
Yeah. It's so far flung from that.
I'm sure it is. I mean, Spinoza was reviled by religions of all stripes.
David, I don't know if you remember
when I vote against Spinoza, as I'm sure you know.
Daniel wants to say, I know he was excommunicated.
No, David, you know, when I asked you about Leibniz, I said, I never understood what a monad is. And what was your reply? It doesn't matter. You don't recall this. So you haven't, I think your comment was, you haven't missed anything by not understanding it. I think that's what you said.
No.
So but David,
I hope we don't reach that conclusion here.
David, in your original question, like what difference does it make if necessity prevails throughout the entire world? How can there be something like a virtue ethic? Like how can we talk about ethics in general? And remember, at the end of Leibniz, we decided that, at least I decided for myself, that to be good is to understand, and to understand in a strictly rational form. That is to be a good human being, is to use your understanding, to be rational, and to understand the world is to be good. And I think that something Spinoza is driving at something similar to that. He's saying that I don't want to talk about the fifth book. I mean, that's months away. But
it's very, very interesting. It's funny because at least just going off Jewish scriptural biblical text, first you do, then you understand. I'll do it right, then I'll figure out, like, get it right, and then worry about, So what your actions are really matters, it doesn't matter how you.
David, can I ask if you've ever read the TTP, the Tractatus, the Theological Political Treatise by Spinoza?
Spinoza? No.
No. Well, the Ethics is his major work, but his second work is and that's where he talks about the Jewish religion, if you want to know where he stands.
Okay, if it's not 1,000 pages, maybe I can get a look at it. Thanks.
Okay, look, we've gone over time, so
Yeah, okay,
so
thank you.
we'll meet again next week and see how it goes. I'll take it up with the axioms, and I'll try to get to proposition 7, which is where we hoped to have ended up this week. Good to see you again, Daniel. I thought I might let you know. I had a suspicion that you might be interested in following up on Spinoza.
Well, I've always liked Spinoza. I've never understood him, and I've always debated whether he's a theist or an atheist. So,
Well, they have all sorts of words to cover him, as well as those two. They call him a pantheist, they call him a panentheist, as well as an atheist. So,
right. Well, thanks a lot. Thank you, guys.
okay, good. Okay, so I'll see you next week.
Okay, bye.
Okay, so listen, I want to have a chat with you, Patrick, before
Okay,
we
I'm still.
we're gonna have a private chat. But thank you everyone
okay.
for coming
Here,
out. It was
we'll
really
set
great.
it,
And I hope the conversation wasn't too heated.
Actually, it was more heated than I expected, but I'm not bothered because I think it's essential that we clear the air about these questions, even if we disagree. So
Yeah, okay, well, we have a fundamental disagreement on one point in particular.
Yeah.
And it's a concern of mine, and that is, you see, the way that I read the ethics is you do the definitions, you do the axioms, and then you take one proposition at a time. And then when you arrive at, just wait till I finish, and you arrive at, hey, there can only be one substance. That comes as a revelation. It follows of necessity. In other words, we're following the logic.
yeah,
It's a logical demonstration.
well, I personally don't believe that Spinoza's arguments are logically watertight. Do you understand?
Okay. That's true. I mean, you can look at his logic and say,
well,
is that a
I'm sure
valid proof?
that you have problems with proposition 5 already. I mean, the one where he says, let's see, what is it? In nature, there cannot be 2 or more substances of the same nature or attribute. That proof is not convincing to me.
Okay. Whether or not it's valid is a question that should be discussed. I'm not saying that.
Do you find it convincing?
I think it's valid. And if it's valid, this is rational philosophy. If it's valid, you got to demonstrate that it's invalid. You have to show that it's invalid.
Well, I'm not persuaded by his argument there.
Okay.
Okay. I'm not persuaded by his argument in where he proves that, or prepares to prove that every substance is necessarily infinite. And I'll explain if I get to be the one to present that proof, I'll explain why I think it's full of holes. But
okay.
I mean,
no, but no, that's not a problem. That's not we're not contending on that point.
Well,
I'm not saying, wait till I finish. I'm not saying that the exposition is absolutely valid every step of the way. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that he's presenting a rational argument, and when he makes a proposition, he provides a proof. The proof relies on a good, firm grasp of the propositions that were previous to that proposition. And that's why when we arrive at a proposition and he offers a proof, it's just not like Spinoza getting up and saying, I believe that God is infinite. What Spinoza is saying is, I believe I have just proved that God is infinite.
That's right.
That's the difference.
I agree. Furthermore, I would side with you in saying that Spinoza believed his proofs were watertight. But I don't. So I
don't believe
I'm
that.
entirely sympathetic to his world view.
That's nothing. That's not what we're talking about, Patrick. What we're talking about is his method. His method is to offer proofs every step of the way.
That's right.
I'm not saying that his proofs are always valid. And it's not like I bow down to Spinoza and say, you've never made a mistake in your reasoning. What I'm saying is that's the form that he uses. That's the mode of exposition. When he chooses the geometrical method, when he chooses...
I agree with the idea of adopting the step by step, the geometrical order. But since I have previously read it and I see how what he's doing is going to play out, that informs my second and third reading through the text.
Sure. Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that.
There's no reason that I can see why I should shut that out from my consciousness.
Okay, well, this is why I believe this is why I believe that it's a problem.
Okay, so I think perhaps I was at fault in trying to impose my perspective. I could have just kept my mouth shut. Perhaps I should have, but the problem that I saw developing is that it's going to take forever to get anywhere at this rate.
I don't know why that would be true, but I suppose it's possibly true. It's not of necessity true, but nevertheless, I guess you see the point that I was getting at. The reason I was just like, if somebody's saying, oh, well, somebody says, well, I don't understand